We are ready for Sunday school. There's something really exciting going on. The teachers are so excited.
You saw them enough? Let's go find them. Where are they? Hey, Pastor Steve. Yeah, right at the top of the stairs. Right at the right-hand side. Perfect. So, I'm glad you all are here, and Lindsay is not well. She's family's just kind of passing around. Anyway, but she's on the mend, and I just stay home because bad. But she'll be back. We have with us the esteemed friend of APC, Dr. Carter over at Princeton. Thank you so much. Last week's class, I listened to it online. Powerful as we talk about who is our neighbor. So I'm going to turn it back over to you. Why don't we pray? Jesus, we come and are just always challenged, provoked, disturbed even by the truth that you have for us in the same way that it was so difficult for the people who first heard you speak the largeness of your vision for the kingdom. We are still today being challenged as we are so much more comfortable living in our own lives and not thinking of how much bigger you see things. So just help us to grow, help us to have a larger kingdom vision and to see others the way that you see them and the way you see us. In Christ's name we pray.
Good morning. How are we doing? Let's see, I don't know. I'm not a singer, but I'm going to give this a go. Are you ready for this? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Won't you be mine? Familiar figure, I think, for many of us. Who is this? Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers. Did you know, I think lesser known, obviously very famous for his long-standing television show. I grew up watching it. And he was a PCUSA minister. He was a Presbyterian minister. I don't know how many people know that about him, but that certainly was part of his sort of the foundation for his neighborly vision, I think, was his sense of faith. And Mr. Rogers actually, I mean, as I understand, I'm not an expert on Mr. Rogers, but I did grow up with him, and the more that I've learned about him, the older I've gotten, the more I have respect for him. I think he was really intentional in using this program to really open kids and their parents, in many cases, minds and hearts to a wider view of the neighbor. He was running this show in a tumultuous time in American life, and not in really preachy ways, but in nevertheless unmistakable ones, was pushing for a vision of a more multiracial, multicultural kind of democratic life here in the United States, and a bigger vision of who our neighbor might be. The series we're in, Who is My Neighbor, and Who is My Neighbor? Last week you may recall, those of you who were here, we talked about, kind of just set the stage for thinking a little bit about what's going on in our nation these days, talked about the extent of polarization in the United States, the weakening influence of religious institutions within folks' lives, the ways in which politics increasingly functions as a kind of, I think, religion for many folks, or has taken the place of that religious institutions once played in sort of offering a structure and a vision in a very tangible way. We talked about the big sort, the ways that people are literally moving to live by folks that agree with them, that see the world the way they do. And then we talked about this very famous parable of the Good Samaritan. Hey, a couple just highlights from that conversation, anything that stands out to you a week later. How does the parable intersect with this kind of question of, the question obviously, who is my neighbor, comes from, it's the question that launches Jesus into that parable. What do we come away with there? Anyone want to venture to remember anything there? I know it's been a week, the fog.
From Amy Jo Levin's book about the original audience expecting them to be the Israel.
Yeah.
That was an eye-opener.
Yeah, this quote I mentioned from this Bible scholar who's reminding us of how jarring it would have been for the original audience that the third person mentioned in the parable was the Samaritan. That would have just been so kind of shocking. Yeah.
Favorite population.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the kind of person that one would maybe, and this is the other thing that she does, right, is maybe wouldn't want to see coming toward one as one is laying in the ditch. I mean, this is sort of the thing that Jesus is playing with. Anyone else remember anything or anything you've been thinking about there? I think what I take away from that and in the context of these conversations is, I love that the Bible says, in order to vindicate himself, the expert in the law asks this question, who is my neighbor? And he's in some ways it seems like he's really interested in shrinking the category of person that he's obligated to love as himself. And Jesus, in the way that he answers the parable, doesn't allow that shrinking. There we go. I love it. Almost on cue. So today, I want to circle back to some of that context that we talked about at the beginning last week and do a deeper dive into the question of why is it that our circles are growing narrower? Why are so many of us these days increasingly inclined to see some of our neighbors as our enemies? I had put up that data last week about concerns about civil war and political violence. As Christians who are called to love our neighbors and our enemies, why are we so often caught in the act of narrowing Jesus' great commandment? I think sometimes if someone came from another planet and landed in the USA these days, they might think that Jesus' great commandment read something like, love your like-minded neighbor as yourself. It's not what Jesus says. But we live in a society, and again, this is a structural thing. So part of what I want to do is attend to the bigger picture reasons. I don't think at the end of the day it's going to boil down to like we are just a collection of individuals who have all decided that we want to maybe just associate with people that already think like us. There's bigger things at work in how we've gotten here, and part of that is the fact that increasingly our neighbors are folks just like us. It's difficult even if one wants to interact sort of with folks who might see the world or experience the world differently. It's increasingly difficult just to do that, given the structure, the geography of our life these days. In the world of politics, I sometimes hear people say, I don't know anyone who voted for X. In the realm of faith, I know people who say, well, I'm this kind of Christian, and I have no interest in talking to someone in that kind of church, or who would go or believe that kind of thing. I want to be clear, and next week I want to come back to this. I mean, I cautioned last week that the answer for me at the end of the day is not just let's be nicer. I don't think that's the right thing. I don't think that's all. That's not what we need in this moment, is just an abundance of niceness. I don't know that niceness is really the missing ingredient. So I don't want to say that. I don't think we all need to be best friends with everyone. I don't think every single space needs to be ideologically or theologically diverse. I think it's totally fine to have spaces where we gather with like-minded folks, and there's good reasons for why we would sometimes want to do that. If you want to enact a vision for our collective life, sometimes you got to be with people and organize with people that share your view and will help you to. So that's not what I don't want to be heard to be saying that at all. I think the worry right now is not that we won't have any spaces where we can gather with like-minded folks. I think it's that those spaces are increasingly all that we have, that we increasingly have only spaces where we gather with folks like ourselves. I think on all sides of our national political divides, there's immense pressure to kind of collapse bigger tents, that places where people mix. Those places are endangered right now, and I think you can see it across our national life. There's an enormous amount of pressure on the leaders of institutions to snuff out dissenters and disagreeers. Last summer, the Presbyterian Church in America canceled a panel on how to be supportive of your pastor and church leaders in a polarized political year because many of the denomination's members perceive one of the panelists to be too polarizing. Many of our Protestant denominations, the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Covenant Church, the Christian Reformed Church, have had distinctive theological leanings throughout their life, but have also been home to a wide array of differently minded Christians from different backgrounds, different parts of the world. But in recent years, that kind of difference has become increasingly unsustainable, and you see these denominations coming apart, sometimes at the seams. It seems like everywhere one looks, we are doubling down on our differences. So today I want to think about why that is. Why is it that difference is, increasingly structuring our life as opposed to finding ways to mingle across it? I don't think it's always been this way, and here I want to add one more cautionary note, which is that I'm anti-nostalgia as a historian. I'm not into nostalgia, so I don't want to be nostalgic. But I am convinced that this is not it's not always been this way. It hasn't always been quite like this, where it's so uncommon to find places and spaces in your life where you would rub elbows with people that think about the world differently. So how'd we get here? There's two things that I want to talk about in terms of the kind of structural pieces of this, and here's one of them. This is the 1948 electoral map. What do you notice here? The South is blue. Yeah, pretty, and quite dark blue in places. Yes, the South is blue. What else? What else stands out here? The West? Oh, the Midwest. Yeah, the Midwest is solidly red. Yep. The Northeast is red. This is a big, the little artifacts like this are helpful in reminding us of the ways that things change. Yeah, so the Northeast, long home to kind of the New England silk stocking, Wall Street, business crowd. They were not, we'll come back to this. There's different shades of red and blue even within this map. What else? Anything else stand out to you here? What's up? The West is a kind of mix. Yep. Yeah. You've got a mix out west of red and blue with no clear, strong party alignment at this particular moment. Yeah. There's a belt line. Say it again. Yeah. Yeah, you have the kind of through the Rust Belt up into the upper Midwest even. It's a little bit of a kind of mixed bag, and you have that also out in the West. So really your Democratic stronghold is the South. Your Republican stronghold, my home state of Kansas, and its neighbor to the north, Nebraska, and then to some extent, New England, right, is the other kind of stronghold. I mean, part of what this map reminds us of, it reminds us of a couple of things. One is, this is before the great kind of political realignment that happens in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. And so this is this other world that was long the way things were, and people would have taken it for granted. Part of what was characteristic of this world, and this is, I think, really critical for thinking about how we've come to be so, separate in the ways that we are set up these days, is that the meaning of being a Democrat or a Republican was a little more amorphous in this period, ideologically. So it wasn't so obvious as it would become that Democrats tended to be more liberal and Republicans tended to be more conservative. In this period, Southern Democrats were often quite conservative, right? Northeastern Republicans also had their kind of cultural conservatism in certain ways, but it was a very different brand that you would have in the prairie Midwest. Oftentimes in the Northeast, the Republican Party alignment was a business kind of framework, right? So part of the story, the political parties in this era, you still have a two-party system where on the one hand, there's these kind of regional alignments, but they're not ideologically lined up in the ways, they're just an ideological grab bag in many ways, where political party identity was rooted less in like a fixed ideological perspective than it was in like relationships and an older kind of coalitional model where people had loyalty to a party, even if it meant that and in fact it did mean, part of what we know, right, is that this political map became unsustainable now this is 84, it's a particular election, but it became unsustainable in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, because part of what happened, in that old map, I'm going to go back here for 1 second. In the old map, the bases, there is? Oh, nice. Okay, great. So I've never used a laser before. Look at this, all right. Yeah, in the old map, your bases of Democratic Party support are here, and the white South would have been one base. It's not as clear on the map, but I gotta see where in the upper Midwest, these sort of industrial cities, white workers in the industrial north. And then after the New Deal, increasingly, the other base of the Democratic Party is who? Anyone know? African Americans. This is the remarkable thing. So both in the South and increasingly in the cities of the upper Midwest, the Democratic Party is relying on the votes of Jim Crow white Southerners, white Northern workers based in the labor movement and whatnot, and increasingly black workers, both in the South and in the North. That becomes unsustainable, and after, let me see here, now I can't get my other thing to work. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay. So again, why not nostalgia? Part of the reason that these parties were able to hold together is there was a willingness. That the fact that was the Democratic coalition in 1948, right, or in the lead up to 1948 through the 1930s and 1940s. It was possible because people were willing to say, we're going to suppress these differences and we're trying to elect. There's a kind of party model where you're just trying to elect your person and you're going to hope to get something out of that. The Republicans in that same era, the party of Lincoln were not pushing hard on civil rights. So part of the reason that the parties are able to kind of be less ideologically aligned is because neither party is really a party of civil rights at that moment. The Democrats, starting in the late 50s and into the early 1960s, are going to eventually, partly out of political sort of strategy, as their coalition is changing. 1948, you get a Dixiecrat revolt, right, in the South, and you start to see white Southerners becoming impatient with the national party's sort of growing interest in civil rights. And over the course of the ensuing 2 decades, as you get the emergence of a surging black freedom movement, some of us, were lived through these, really momentous times in American history. The Democratic Party at the national level would take step after step after step in the direction of supporting the civil rights movement. Famously in 64 and 65, Lyndon B. Johnson signed these massive pieces of federal civil rights legislation. In 1964, he signed the Civil Rights Act that was designed to, bring the federal government, to deliver on the promise of these Reconstruction-era amendments that had been passed 100 years before. He signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, famously commented on the side that he had signed away the South for a generation. And in fact, he did, in a way. The South, and this is a complicated story too, but you have a massive political realignment where, as we know, the South becomes, in the wake of Ronald Reagan, the bedrock of the Republican Party. The Northeast is going to be, not in 1984, but increasingly moving in a blue direction. And then you have the Midwest as sort of a contested ground, the Prairie Midwest more red still, the Upper Midwest more blue. Part of what has happened in the wake of the civil rights movement is the parties reshuffle and become gradually, it takes time, right? You have a lot of Reagan Democrats, right? And whatnot, so it takes time. But over the course of a generation after the civil rights movement, the parties become more ideologically consistent, which is what they had not been in the past. So part of what that meant, right, is if you have these two big parties, but they're not, in some ways, they're not that far apart at mid-century. And again, that's not necessarily something to be nostalgic about, because one of the things they weren't that far apart about was that no one wanted to fight for civil rights, right? But over the course of the ensuing generations, they moved consistently apart. I looked for new data because I think this is only 2014. I would be fascinated to see how people would chart this today, because I think we're seeing kind of the transformation of at least one of the two major parties right now, and it'd be interesting to think about how that reshuffles these dynamics. But there's no doubt that one of the driving factors in terms of how folks in the U.S. have come to be organized in a way, not like just choosing, but we've been organized apart from one another, has to do with the realignment ideologically of political parties. The other big piece. Some of you may remember the days when Walter Cronkite reigned as the anchorman on CBS Evening News. Over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, another turbulent season in American life, Cronkite became known as the most trusted man in America. The middle decades of the 20th century were a heyday, as many of us know, for network newscasts. And I think in retrospect, people can think from the perspective of now, well, it had always been like that, and how'd we get here? But actually, that was the real exception to the rule, I think, historically speaking. That moment at the mid-century where you have everybody watching Walter Cronkite or a couple of others, that moment is actually not representative of what it had long been. In the 19th century, so in the late 1800s, American journalism was very diffuse. It was very ideological. There were penny papers reflecting every political point of view, from the most reactionary to the most radical and everything in between. The Cronkite era, with its kind of air of consensus, as we look back on it, may prove to be kind of the great exception. But for those who grow up in that world, what we've seen in the last couple of decades has been really quite something. And it has had really significant implications for how we live with one another, including right up to the present moment, I think. First, cable news, and then the rise of the internet and social media, with so many folks across generational lines getting their news these days, I guess, which I'm not on this, from TikTok. TikTok is, I think, a major source of news for some folks. Facebook, X, all of these different sites. And we all know, I mean, whatever your point of view is, you can find a channel or a site that suits you. Part of the interesting, we're not that far into the age of the internet in the scheme of things, right? I mean, this is like a development in my lifetime. I grew up, well, we'll come back to that in just a second. I've got a whole thing on this. But it's not that old. And I think at the dawn of the internet age, there's this idea that there's going to be this remarkable democratization of information. And it's going to be really good. And in some ways it is, right? We've all had the experience of sitting around with friends and being like, what, when did that movie come out or whatever? And you can just look it up and you don't have to no more need to go back home. And you can get instant answers to all kinds of questions. But the overall picture, the idea that maybe was around when the internet was first breaking into our lives, that the kind of availability of information would make us better educated and more well-rounded, I'm not sure that has worked out to be quite the case. We're increasingly, as we all know, we're drawn into, and not by, again, choice is a factor in the things that I'm talking about today. But in my way of looking at this is there's really something even larger than just our individual choices that is at work in this. There are algorithms that lead us toward, you put a thing into Google and the algorithm churns out and gives you a different set of websites than it would give me, right? There's a kind of way in which the kinds of data that companies are drawing on in order to kind of structure your own individualized experience of the internet is remarkable. And the challenge, I think, is that sometimes when we get sort of taken down the algorithm, you can easily end up believing and bearing false witness against one's neighbors. In an excellent book, Why We Are Polarized, New York Times political journalist Ezra Klein writes about how the more political media folks consume, the more distorted their perspective often becomes. This is Klein. Democrats believed 44% of Republicans earned over $250,000 a year. It's actually 2%. Republicans believe that 38% of Democrats were gay, lesbian, or bisexual. The correct answer is about 6%. Democrats believe that more than 4 out of every 10 Republicans are seniors. In truth, seniors make up about 20% of the GOP. Republicans believe that 46% of Democrats are black and 44% belong to a union. In reality, about 24% of Democrats are African American and less than 11% belong to a union. You might think, well, we just need to get outside, I hear this a lot, outside of our echo chambers. If we expand the kinds of media we consume, then surely we'll end up with a clear-eyed view of our neighbors. But in our sort of social media world, this doesn't work. This does not work. Klein cites a study in which Republicans who followed a liberal bot online became much more conservative. And Democrats who followed a conservative bot online became much more liberal. Consuming media from quote-unquote the other side doesn't enlighten one or help one to get a better rounded sense of one's neighbor. It tends to make us angrier. As we listen to media from the other side, we are confirmed in our sense of just how right we are and just how wrong they are. What's happening here? So I think there's a lot to say about this, and I want to try to get through this so we can talk about it. I think there's a way in which the big data and the algorithms are shifting the ways in which our identities as individuals are formed and activated. As humans, we have all kinds of identities. I'm a historian, an author, husband, father, football fan, runner, child of the 1980s. We could go on. Each of us could give a laundry list of different things that are part of who we are or what we're up to in the world. And it used to be that most of our identities were not especially polarized or polarizing. If If you were an NFL fan or you were a Whole Foods shopper or whatever, that was just an interest or a preference which might combine with almost any kind of political outlook. But this goes back to the thing we talked about last week. Increasingly, our political identities are becoming a kind of mega identity, which swallows up all of our other identities. So take the NFL as an example. Before the Colin Kaepernick protests of a few years ago, 60% of both Clinton and Trump voters, this is back in like the 2016 era, viewed the NFL favorably. After the Kaepernick episode, the league's favorability among Trump voters plummeted to 30%. Then Nike made Kaepernick its spokesperson, and so Nike's favorability rose with some constituencies and fell with other constituencies. This is just one example. It's not just the NFL. It's lattes, it's sushi, it's the New York Times, it's Whole Foods, it's Chick-fil-A, Cracker Barrel, Fox News, country music. More and more our whole lives are swallowed up by a kind of political mega identity that offers a structure and a coherence to the ways that not only we vote, but also that we consume, worship, all the things, right? Our whole life. Social media accelerates this process because it offers endless opportunities to identify with something and to flaunt that identity. Here's Ezra Klein again. He says, one of BuzzFeed's most popular series was, quote, X things only a Y would understand. A Google search for these keywords brings up articles like 14 things only anxious people will understand. 19 things only people with fibromyalgia will understand. 53 things only 80s girls can understand. Many of these kinds of articles are in good fun. I especially liked one a few years ago, here's back to the generational thing, that correctly pinpointed me, if I can get this to go, as a member of the Oregon Trail generation. This is a micro-generation between I'm too young for Gen X, too old to be a true millennial. I am part of the group of folks that played the Oregon Trail on Apple IIes in elementary school. This was a moment. 1977 and 1983. Kids born in those years are part of this micro-generation. I love it. I identify with it. My sister's 9 years younger than me. She didn't play Oregon Trail. It was gone by the time she showed up in school. So some of this stuff is fun. We've all seen these pieces that are fun, and you can share them with your friends and whatnot. But there can be some darker sides to the ways that social media mobilizes our identity. It can be easy to fall down rabbit holes on sites like YouTube. I gave a talk in Colorado actually the week of the election this year about faith in public life, and there were some college students that came, and a group of young white men at this local college who talked about when they were 11 or 12 years old, they fell down YouTube rabbit holes. It was wild, and you know, this is something that I didn't grow up with YouTube, and I'm still not a big YouTube person, but this is how YouTube works. It seeks to draw its users deeper into the things that they're already interested in. So this is Klein again. Videos about vegetarianism lead to videos about veganism. Videos about jogging lead to videos about running ultramarathons. It's one thing when your interest is vegetarianism or jogging, but quite another when your interest is politics. On YouTube and TikTok and countless other sites, folks can fall into deep rabbit holes that end up radicalizing them in one direction or another and leading them to not just dismiss, but really to sort of stop respecting even folks who don't see the world the ways that their particular kind of YouTube-driven vision of the world works. So between the political realignments of the last generation and the ways that our media environment works, where we are all constantly of great interest to big data and the folks that construct these algorithms, and we're all living inside, in many ways, these algorithms. You can't live outside of the algorithms. It's a very radical existence to live outside the algorithms these days. You kind of have to be out, you know, in a way that you would have, you know, people who rejected the electrical grid or something like that. You know, you're really outside of kind of the mainstream of American life. What do we do? I don't have, this is where we're going to open up to conversation, because I want to hear your thoughts too, but a couple quick things. I mean, I think it's one interesting exercise is, you know, if you can just even do it for 15 minutes, if you want to do it for an hour, that starts to get exhausting. But one of these days when you're online, especially if you're on social media, try to be really just do a little experiment with yourself and try to pay attention as you're online, especially on social media, to what parts of your own identity are being activated by the content that you're coming across, whether it's from a friend or from a news site or whatever. When you see that post, what value, what aspect of yourself is it tapping into? And what are the emotions? Because this is the thing that's really interesting and maybe troubling. I mean, part of the way that our social media and phones and all that kind of work these days is you can just you can just endlessly scroll, right? The scrolling phenomenon is like you can just scroll and you kind of lose track of time and you forget. But the other thing that's happening as you're scrolling is you are having, maybe imperceptible to yourself because we just are so in the habit, reactions. Those posts are, the ones that you stop and linger on a little bit more, and Big Data makes a note of that, right? They're making you feel something. Angry, anxious, sad, outraged, happy, joyful, whatever that is, right? If you can, spend 15 minutes paying attention to the kinds of what social media is activating in you as you scroll, and how are those emotions leading you to think and act with respect to your neighbors, maybe especially to folks who are not in your inner circles. I think this is a worthy activity, but it's pretty exhausting because it's not really what this is designed to do. You're supposed to be more unconsciously just scrolling along. And it's certainly not the answer to, how do we find our way forward in a world where our lives are so structured by these algorithms? We're swimming in media all the time, monitoring which one of our identities is being activated, whether positively or negatively. It's just not going to be possible for most of us most of the time. The thing that, from what I can tell from my reading on this stuff, that is the more maybe viable thing one can do if one is concerned about what I've been describing, though it has its own challenges, especially in a moment like this one. We can talk about those. I'd love to talk about them. The thing that tends to be the best break on our tendency to demonize those who don't see the world the way we do is a personal relationship with someone else who sees the world that way. A conservative or a liberal who plays on the same soccer team or serves on the same PTA board or crucially sits in the same sanctuary as someone from the other side might still strongly disagree with that person, but they might be slower to hate them, might be slower to dismiss them out of hand, might find that they are frustrated a lot by what the person says or thinks, but they might have curiosity about them, they might be able to muster some generosity, and sometimes even love someone else who sees the world quite differently than one does. And again, the answer for me, and we'll talk about this more next week, is not just niceness, but I do think we lack a kind of curiosity. One of the things the algorithm offers us is this sense that we don't need to talk to those people because we already know them and we already know how wrong they are. And so it really is not good for our sense of curiosity. Curiosity, which is a pretty foundational aspect of friendship. Being interested in another person. By the time we roll up to someone new, we already recognize that they shop differently than we are. We've never seen them at our church. We don't live, right? There's all these ways in which, again, our lives are so structured to be apart that it can be hard to even sometimes have these encounters. Tuning into social media channels that spout different views than your own tends, as we said, to lead you to double down on what you already think, but a meaningful relationship with another person who disagrees with you can still work as a brake, I think, on our tendency to reduce Jesus' commandment to something like love your like-minded neighbor as yourself. I wonder if you've experienced this in your own life. I have experienced it in my own life, probably because of my own biography. I grew up in worlds that are so different from the worlds that I live in today. And I've found ways to maintain meaningful relationships across that time and distance, even though it can be really hard. And I think this is part of why increasingly folks don't want it. People, we talked about this last week. It's important to me to live in a place where most people share my political views. The more consistently conservative or consistently liberal you are, the more likely you are to say, yeah, it's important to me to live in a place where most people share my political views. 50% of consistent conservatives said that, 35% of consistent liberals said that. Most of my close friends share my political views. Consistent conservatives 63% of the time, consistent liberals 49% of the time. Folks increasingly, and I actually see this on my social media, people sort of saying, you know, it's fine to cut folks out of your life. And I think sometimes some of us may need to do that. I do think, I'm not saying that that's always the wrong thing to do. But if we all do it all the time, what do we end up with? I mean, that's the thing that we've seen, you know, in other parts of the world and in our own country. Like, what can happen when people start to not just disagree, but to reject the humanity, in some sense, of people on the other side. That can lead us down some really, I think, quite disturbing roads. This is brand new data. This is from 2023. Americans increasingly say political conversations with people they disagree with are stressful and frustrating. I mean, this seems relatable, but you can see this stressful and frustrating. So this is versus the other option people were given was interesting and informative. So you can see interesting and informative has been going down, stressful and frustrating has been going up, and then it divides it between folks who lean Republican and folks who lean Democrat, and you kind of see the trends are more or less parallel. Part of what I wonder about is, you know, what is the role of congregations in this story? What if congregations were places that were known for being places that radiated a kind of love of neighbors, regardless of who they may be, in the spirit of the parable last week? That would be really quite remarkable these days, I think. I think it's really tough because congregations are situated geographically. And we talked about this last week, right? And the geography of American life is such that this is not really, for many congregations, a realizable vision. I don't know, it'd be interesting. I'd love to hear more about what you think here. It may be that even if congregations tend to reflect increasingly sorted communities, that there may be other ways that congregations can be intentional about expanding their life, their mission, their activities to find ways to kind of get outside of themselves from time to time. I want you to talk to your neighbor for just a moment, and then we'll come back together and do a little sharing. I'm curious, as you reflect on your own life, do you find that you today have meaningful relationships across lines of difference in your life? Do you have opportunities to build those kinds of relationships? What excites you about those kinds of relationships, and what scares you about those kinds of relationships? Talk to your neighbor for a moment. Do you have meaningful relationships across lines of difference in your life, and what are those like? And then we'll come back together and chat together. So take a couple minutes and talk to your neighbors, though. What's it called?
Stolen Focus. It's the guy that invented Infinite Scroll wrote it. better.
Take another minute, and then we'll come back together. I know that we could talk about this all day, but take one more minute. Can we come back together? Everybody's deep in conversation. Take one more minute. One more minute. All right. We got to wind it down. I can sense y'all will just talk the rest of the morning, but let's come back together. What'd you learn? What'd you say? Do you have meaningful relationships across lines of difference, and what are those like for you? What'd you come up with? Anybody? I heard interesting conversations. Oh, good. I always look to Nancy for the answers. Come on. Okay. Well, what? Yeah. Tell us a little more.
Let's see. I guess the answer for me is that yes, I can have conversations with people that are different than me, and I think in this community, in the community of people who are believers, there are foundational tenets that allow us to have those different conversations. So I do have friends that are different from me.
Yes. Yeah, faith can, at its best, be something that can help to facilitate those kinds of relationships. Others? Yeah.
I'm thinking of the old adage. Discuss politics or religion.
Do not discuss politics or religion. Okay.
You know.
Okay, with anybody.
Because I'm just sharing with these folks.
Yeah.
This last, say, election prior.
Yeah.
I had some great friends.
Yeah.
Men I worked with for over 50 years.
Yeah.
Tired. I went to breakfast every month. Turned on me.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And they just stayed.
Yeah.
Became vicious.
That's hard.
And I try to keep an open mind. I'll listen to you.
Yeah.
I respect your opinion.
Yeah.
Agree with it.
Sure.
I'm not going to attack you.
Right.
And
Right.
if you ask me, because I'm listening to you, and I'm saying, where's he going with all this?
Where am I?
Where am I going? I think the biggest culprit is the media.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
have less time to actually do any research. So they depend on these little telephones.
Yeah.
They'll tune that one station.
Yeah.
And you go on social media, and I purposely read it, and it's there's such a consistency of talking.
Sure.
They're not original opinions. You can tell they're talking points that they've heard. Some paid doctor reader.
One thing that's interesting about social media too, I don't know if you saw this a few years ago, they did a study of like the shape of your social media experience depending on what big data knows about you. And you can have a really different experience on those websites depending on kind of what the website thinks you want to see. So it crafts an environment for you. In fact, if you go into your settings on Facebook, it has identified you as with a political affiliation, not a political party, but you can go into your settings and see what it thinks you are. You used to be able to do this. I haven't done this in a couple of years, but it'll tell you like it thinks you're moderate, conservative, extremely liberal. That's in your settings. And then it's creating a digital experience for you. So somebody who Facebook thinks is moderately conservative will see different information than somebody who Facebook thinks is extremely liberal. I think I'm agreeing with you that I think that the media landscape is one of the things that drives this wider phenomenon. What else? What else do people?
Like the less you talk about it, the better that.
The less about it.
The less you talk about politics.
Yeah.
The better. I agree with that chart.
Yeah.
It can be very
stressful.
Stressful. I'm not a debater.
Right.
Like I said to the group, I can see, like some of my friends, I can see their point of view.
Sure.
Right? It's like, geez, I can't afford groceries. I can see that. But I think they're looking at it the wrong way.
Yeah.
But again, like I said, they have these strong opinions which are way out there.
Yeah.
It's just like,
I think one of the things that these comments are helpful with is, I mean, there is a way, again, in which we are increasingly likely to just not want to talk to somebody. You can identifiably tell if someone has a different outlook than you, usually, again, by where they shop, where they live, where they worship, right? And there are ways in which, because I personally, I'll just say, I think, politics at the end of the day boils down to a question of like, how do we live in the world together, right? So it's hard for me to say we can't talk about politics because it's like, but maybe it's a way in which, the ways in which we do tend to talk about politics these days and the ways in which those kinds of conversations often mean that we meet somebody different than ourselves at the point of maximal disagreement, tension, frustration, and stress. Whereas, I mean, I did have a friend, when I lived in Valparaiso, Indiana, which is a very purpley kind of community, I had a good friend who was pretty lefty, but who played on a soccer team with folks from very much right of center. And the purpose of the soccer team experience was not to bridge build politically. It was just to play soccer. And they had a great time together on the soccer team. And in some sense, we probably do need more of that in our life and society, where for me, it could be that over a beer after the game, you might talk about stuff, but you have this foundation of, hey, that was awesome, that the play where we scored that goal, or where, the game, you have these other kinds of bonds and like ties of affection to people. I think that's part of what seems to be so strained right now, is any kinds of ties of affection to people who see the world differently. Yep. Yeah, please. Yeah.
One is that it's absolutely right that putting a face
Mm-hmm.
on other is hugely important.
Yep.
And there are very few opportunities for that. At the seminary, getting students out of the classroom into a temple, mosque, boudoir is hugely important. To sense that these are real people with whom we have much in common. And in our area, we're blessed with so many opportunities for doing that. And we should make more of them. Ramadan is coming to an end. One would participate in an iftar. Many mosques welcome visitors for that kind of occasion. The other thing I was thinking, just really quickly, is to get off social media and read a bit. And what I found really helpful recently was an ethnography of the MAGA right, which is called Stolen Pride. And it's by an anthropologist, a woman at the University of California, now retired, who spent years and years in Eastern Kentucky trying to figure out what helps to account for the deep, deep anger and resentment that boiled up over the years. And I would recommend it to anyone, called Stolen Pride. I found that I needed to read to get someone's view richly detailed about the lives of those people who were so, their experience in the world is so different from mine. I needed that.
That's helpful. That's really helpful. Thank you. I would see if there's anyone else, and then I'll, yes.
You know what I'm struggling with. Let me first start by saying I'm an independent, I'm an immigrant, so I didn't really grow up with a Democratic. So I never knew until I took it a little more seriously. Is that people are able to separate their faith from their daily lives. You know, for instance, during Amy Clombert's hearings, she mentioned, you know, she was asked, well, how's your Catholic faith going to come into play when the abortion topic comes up? And she said, no, it's not gonna be a problem. You know where that is. So, and I posted about it. I'm like, I don't know how someone can claim that their faith isn't informing their decisions that they make. And then from when you were last, we talked about the Big Ten. And post-election, you know, analysis saying the 10 is too big. We're focusing on the social issues. When my faith is, you know, I feel like I need to stand up for people who are being demeaned. And so that's what I'm struggling with.
That's helpful. The thing that I want to come back to next week, I mean, for me, sometimes people will hear, you know, a call to sort of engage in a human relationship with someone across a significant lines of difference, and they could be religious, political, all different kinds of lines of difference that are structuring our lives. Sometimes that ends up, people think, oh, well, that means it's just, let's set aside everything that we believe in and find a way to create some imaginary common ground where none of us really live, but we can find ways to be nice to each other for a short period of time while we have a cup of coffee or something like that. And I want to suggest next week that there's a way to be really deeply rooted in your own convictions and your own deep values, and to also be able to have a kind of generosity and curiosity toward people who don't already share those. And I'm part of it, this is a spoiler alert, but I mean, for me, actually, if you care so deeply about your vision, values, hopes for the world, the best way, one of the best ways, there's probably other great ways, but one really important and less used way to advance those values in the world is to be friends with somebody who doesn't share them. Because it's in the context of those kinds of relationships, this is again the big spoiler for next week, that people are most likely to change their minds. That's what the data, I think, would suggest, that it's when people realize that this person I love and care about, who sees, insert difficult, controversial, contested issue here, so differently than I do, I feel called to consider in a new way the way they see it. And that is where, to me, I think also things can get really interesting. So I got to wrap up. I'm over time. But I'll just say for now, I think part of the message for me today is not, again, it's not a call to just niceness. It's a call to not letting the algorithms and the other sort of bigger things here structure our experience of our neighbors, finding ways to create human connection in the midst of an algorithm-driven world. But next week I want to come back to that, and once, you know, in the context of human connection, how do we hold love and conviction together? in the context of these kinds of relationships, because I think it's possible to do that. I'll say a brief blessing for us as we head out. God, we come to you grateful for this time, for these friends. Thank you for the gift of life and the gift of life with one another. God, be with us in these difficult, challenging, frightening for many times. And God, give us the strength and courage to forge connections with our neighbors, even when it's hard, to find ways to love them and to also work alongside them for the world that you hope for. Amen. Thank you all so much. See you next week.